While I was in the hospital, my sister yanked out my oxygen line and said, "Quit faking it, you just want pity." My parents watched without saying a word as I gasped for air. They didn't know my surgeon was right behind them. At my grandpa's will reading, he walked forward, touched my sister's shoulder, and spoke 6 words that changed everything. "My name's Mike, and this is where my story really kicks off." Lying there in a hospital room, my sister Lena leaned over and ripped the oxygen line out of my nose and snapped that I needed to quit pretending because I was just fishing for sympathy, while my parents stood frozen and said absolutely nothing. As I fought for air, none of them realized my surgeon was standing right behind them, the same man who would later show up at Grandpa's will reading, place a hand on Lena's shoulder, and say 6 quiet words that brought everything crashing to an end. The harsh fluorescent lights above my hospital bed buzzed non-stop. This annoying electrical whine that had become the background noise of my life for the past week. Stage 3 lung cancer doesn't ease its way in or give you a warning. It storms into a routine checkup, turns an everyday cough into a life or death situation, and forces you to stare down your own mortality at 28, when you're supposed to be thinking about promotions and dating apps instead of survival rates. From the very beginning, my family reacted in a way that felt off. While I sat shaking in Dr. Harris's office as he carefully explained where the tumor was and laid out an aggressive treatment plan, my younger sister Lena seemed way more focused on how my diagnosis might mess with her engagement party. She'd gotten engaged to Ryan Cole 3 months earlier, and somehow my cancer had become nothing more than an inconvenient scheduling problem. She actually asked if I could push the surgery until after the wedding, staring at her perfect nails and reminding everyone that 200 invitations were already out. Our mom, Susan, rested a hand on Lena's arm, and for a second I thought she was about to shut her down, but instead she said Lena had a point and that events like this took months to organize, adding that surely waiting a few weeks wouldn't change much for me. My dad, Tom, didn't even look up, just kept scrolling through emails on his phone like the conversation belonged to some other family entirely, and that silence hit harder than any words could have. The surgery went ahead no matter what Lena wanted, because Dr. Harris made it clear that with an aggressive cancer, every single day counted. The tumor was pressing against my bronchial tubes, and each breath already felt like work, so waiting would have meant slowly suffocating while my sister danced at her reception. Everyone said recovery would be the hardest part, but the surgery itself actually went well. Dr. Harris removed the main tumor and several nearby lymph nodes, and he told me the outlook was cautiously optimistic as long as I committed to chemo and radiation. What nobody warned me about was that recovery also required rest, oxygen, and some level of family support, which turned out to be completely missing at my house. Lena showed up on the 3rd day after surgery wearing a cream-colored designer dress and heels that clicked loudly against the hospital floor, with our parents trailing behind her looking like they'd been dragged away from something far more important. She didn't even lower her voice before announcing that I looked awful, loud enough that anyone nearby could hear, then questioned whether I was even really sick and said the whole thing seemed over the top. I tried to answer, but between the oxygen tube, leftover anesthesia, and the morphine dulling the pain in my thoughts, all I could manage was a weak sound somewhere between a cough and a word. Lena immediately turned to our parents and pointed out that I could barely talk, asking how they knew I wasn't just doing this for attention. That accusation hurt more than the surgical incision across my chest. Growing up, I'd always been the responsible one: straight A's, full scholarship, steady job at an architecture firm, while Lena was the wild kid who needed constant supervision and occasional bail money, yet somehow my very real medical crisis had turned into a plot to steal the spotlight from her engagement. Dad finally glanced up from his phone and said I'd always had a flair for drama, bringing up a time I got sick before her high school graduation and claiming I just didn't want to go, even though that illness had actually put me in urgent care for dehydration, but correcting him felt useless. They'd already decided on their version of events, and I was too weak to fight it. The conversation rolled on around me like I wasn't even there, with Lena complaining about caterers, Ryan's difficult mother, and a photographer's limited schedule, while Mom soothed her and Dad nodded along, and no one once asked how I felt or what my treatment would look like. My cancer had been reduced to a minor inconvenience in Lena's wedding storyline. Then, without warning, she jumped up, stepped to the side of my bed, and before I could react, grabbed the oxygen tube and yanked it free, telling me to stop faking it and accusing me again of just wanting pity. The panic hit instantly as my damaged lungs struggled to pull in air. The room started to spin, and my hands clawed at the sheets while I tried and failed to call for a nurse. My parents just stood there and watched as I gasped, fumbled for the call button, and felt my vision narrow into white spots in creeping darkness. And when Mom finally spoke, all she said was that maybe Lena was taking it a little too far. In the same tone you'd use for someone breaking a small social rule, not risking someone's life. Lena just crossed her arms and said I needed to stop being so dramatic. I heard Lena laugh and say something like, "Look at him gasping like a fish, this is ridiculous." And what none of them realized, what they couldn't have realized because they were too wrapped up in their own noise, was that Dr. Harris had walked into the room about half a minute before Lena yanked out my oxygen. He'd been standing quietly in the doorway, reading my chart, when my sister did something that could legally be called assault on a recovering surgical patient. His voice sliced through the room sharp and cold, asking exactly what she thought she was doing. Everyone spun around at once, Lena's face going pale, my parents straightening up like kids caught cheating on a test. Dr. Harris moved fast to my bedside and slid the oxygen tube back in with steady, practiced hands, and within seconds that blessed air filled my lungs again. The panic slowly drained away, leaving me wiped out and hollow, weighed down by exhaustion and a deep sense of betrayal. "Dear." Harris told all of them to step outside, his tone firm and final, the kind that doesn't leave room for debate, and when Lena tried to argue, one look from him shut her right up. They shuffled out looking small, and through the door window I watched him lay into them in the hallway, his gestures sharp and deliberate, whatever he said turning my dad's face red and making my mom clutch at her throat, while Lena actually started crying, which was hard to stomach considering she just tried to suffocate me. "Winder." Harris came back in, his expression softened but there was still anger behind it, and he told me he'd had security remove them and that they wouldn't be allowed back unless I personally approved it, which he strongly advised against until I was fully recovered and discharged. I managed to thank him, my voice rough and strained, and he went on to say he'd documented everything in my medical record and that what my sister did counted as assault, meaning if I ever chose to press charges, the paperwork would back me up, but for now my only job was to heal because my body had been through enough and stress would only slow things down. The next few days blurred together with meds, breathing treatments, and constant check-ins from nurses who clearly knew what had happened, and showed me a level of kindness that made my family's behavior feel even uglier by comparison. Dr. Harris stopped in every morning to review my progress and make sure I was comfortable. On the 5th day, I got a call from my Aunt Marjorie, my mom's older sister who lived a few states away, and she was furious that no one had told her about my surgery sooner, saying my mother claimed I was doing fine and didn't want visitors, adding bitterly that she should have known better because Mom had always been a terrible liar. Marjorie showed up the next morning with flowers, magazines, and a determined look, and I told her everything from the diagnosis to the surgery to what happened in that hospital room, and with every detail her face hardened. When I finished, she flat out said she was calling her lawyer because what Lena did was criminal and what my parents did by standing there was just as bad, and that she was going to make sure my grandfather knew exactly what kind of people his son had raised. My grandpa, Walter Bennett, was my dad's father and the unquestioned head of the family, 86 years old and still sharp as hell, a self-made real estate tycoon whose opinion carried serious weight, especially with my dad, who practically worshipped him and feared disappointing him more than anything. I tried weakly to say Grandpa didn't need to get dragged into this and that it would only upset him, but Marjorie shut that down fast, saying he'd always suspected my parents favored Lena and now there was no denying it, and besides he'd already been talking about updating his will, which made this information pretty important. I was released from the hospital 8 days after surgery with strict orders to rest, avoid stress, and come back for follow-ups. And instead of taking me home, Marjorie insisted I stay in her hotel suite so I'd actually be taken care of. She hired a private nurse, made sure I had everything I needed, and didn't let me lift a finger. My parents called twice, and both conversations were tense and short, with my mom claiming I was overreacting and my dad accusing me of tearing the family apart by not just forgiving and forgetting, neither of them offering an apology or acknowledging that what happened was attempted murder disguised as sibling drama. Lena sent a text saying she and Ryan had postponed the engagement party because I'd ruined everything and hoped I was happy, and I blocked her number without a second thought. 6 weeks later, I got a formal invitation to Grandpa Walter's house for a mandatory family meeting, the card making it clear that skipping it would have serious consequences. Marjorie drove me out to the estate, a massive coastal property Grandpa had bought decades earlier, with a house that showed off his success in every brick, stone, and perfectly kept garden, a place I'd loved as a kid when he'd sneak me cookies and teach me chess on the terrace. When we pulled in, my parents' car was already there, along with Lena's red convertible that Ryan had given her as an engagement gift, and my stomach knotted up as the reality hit that I was about to see all of them again for the first time since the hospital, my healing chest aching with stress before I even stepped out of the car. Marjorie squeezed my hand as we walked up to the front door and quietly reminded me that I hadn't done anything wrong, that I was the victim here and I shouldn't let anyone twist it any other way. Grandpa Walter's housekeeper, Mrs. Caldwell, met us inside and guided us into the formal living room where everyone was already waiting. My parents sat rigidly on an old antique sofa, while Lena was planted in a wingback chair with Ryan standing close behind her like he was gearing up for a fight. Every person in that room looked uneasy except Grandpa Walter, who sat in his usual chair by the fireplace, calm and unreadable. He cleared his throat and announced that everyone was finally there, then said he'd called this meeting to deal with some recent events that had come to his attention, events that disgusted him and needed to be addressed immediately. My dad shifted in his seat and tried to cut in, saying the hospital situation had been blown out of proportion and that people tended to get dramatic, but Grandpa shut him down with a single sharp word: silence, fixing him with a look that carried more disappointment than anger. He told my dad he would speak only when asked and that until then he would sit there and listen. The room went dead quiet. Lena turned pale and started fidgeting with her engagement ring, while my mom folded her hands so tightly in her lap her knuckles turned white. Grandpa continued, laying out exactly what had happened, reminding everyone that 3 weeks earlier I'd undergone major surgery to remove cancer from my lung at 28 years old, facing something that could have killed me, and instead of support, I'd been met with neglect, dismissal, and outright assault while I was recovering. My dad tried to interrupt again, saying assault was too strong a word and that Lena hadn't meant anything by it, but Grandpa snapped at him to be quiet and spelled it out plainly, that Lena had intentionally removed my oxygen tube while I was struggling to breathe, that it was documented in medical records, witnessed by a surgeon, and reported by the hospital, and that it met the legal definition of criminal assault, made worse by the fact that my parents stood there and did nothing. My mom finally spoke up, trying to defend Lena by saying she'd been stressed about her engagement party and emotions were running high, calling it a momentary lapse in judgment. Grandpa responded coldly that forgetting a birthday was a lapse in judgment, but interfering with medical equipment keeping someone alive was attempted murder, and minimizing it said everything he needed to know about her character. Lena finally spoke through shaking words, claiming she hadn't thought it would really hurt me, and that she just wanted me to stop acting like I was dying and stealing attention from her special moment. Grandpa corrected her firmly, saying I had cancer, I'd had part of my lung removed, I wasn't acting, and the fact that she saw my illness as some kind of attention grab showed a shocking lack of empathy and maturity. The silence afterward felt heavy, with Ryan trying to comfort Lena while she brushed him off, my dad staring at the floor, and my mom caught between shame and stubbornness. Grandpa reached for a folder on the side table and explained that he'd called us together because he'd made changes to his estate, had new paperwork drawn up, and wanted everyone to hear it directly instead of finding out after he was gone. I remember telling Marjorie he wouldn't do anything drastic, that family loyalty would outweigh his disappointment, and realized I'd been completely wrong. Grandpa looked straight at my dad and said that as his only son, he'd hoped he'd inherit his character as well as his name, but instead had proven weak and willing to sacrifice one child for another's convenience, and that he was ashamed to call him his heir. My dad tried to plead and explain, but Grandpa shut that down too, saying his actions said enough. He opened the folder and announced he was removing my dad as executor of the estate and as the primary beneficiary, stating clearly that the real estate holdings, investments, and properties would no longer pass to him. The look on my dad's face was pure shock, like his entire future had just collapsed in front of him, and my mom gasped, saying Grandpa couldn't do this after everything my dad had devoted to the company. Grandpa replied calmly that my dad had been well paid for his work, but what he hadn't earned was respect or legacy, and those belonged to someone worthy. Lena, now completely white, asked what about her, insisting she was his granddaughter too and couldn't be punished for one mistake. Grandpa repeated the word mistake with clear contempt and told her plainly that trying to harm her brother wasn't a mistake, that her behavior revealed her to be selfish, entitled, and cruel, and that those traits weren't something he intended to reward with inheritance. Then he turned to me, and for the first time since we arrived, his expression softened, telling me that I'd shown more strength and dignity in facing my illness than the rest of the family deserved. You never asked for anything, never complained once, and somehow kept your dignity intact even while being treated horribly by the very people who were supposed to protect you. And that kind of character is exactly what I built my legacy for, Grandpa Walter said, his voice steady. My throat tightened and I felt emotion swell up as I told him I didn't understand. He looked at me and said simply that he was leaving everything to me, the business, the properties, the investments, all of it, explaining that his attorney had already prepared the documents naming me the sole beneficiary, with full control and no obligation to share with anyone. The room exploded instantly, my dad jumping to his feet yelling, my mom breaking down into sobs, Lena's crying turning frantic and uncontrollable, and Ryan looking like he wished he could melt into the wall, while only Aunt Marjorie stayed calm, squeezing my hand without saying a word. Grandpa Walter raised his hand again and brought the chaos to a halt, stating firmly that his decision was final, the paperwork already signed, witnessed and notarized, and that any attempt to contest it would only waste time and money, advising them to accept the consequences of their actions with whatever dignity they could scrape together. My dad accused me of manipulating him and lying to steal his inheritance, but Grandpa shut that down immediately, saying I'd told him nothing, that Marjorie had contacted him, that he'd personally reviewed the medical records with his attorney, and that Dr. Harris had confirmed every detail, adding that their continued attempts to minimize what happened only proved they didn't deserve what he'd built. Lena shot to her feet, face red and blotchy, shouting that it wasn't fair, that I'd always been the favorite and now I was getting everything just because I got sick. But Grandpa corrected her coldly, saying I was getting everything because when I faced the worst moment of my life, I did it with dignity, focusing on healing instead of bitterness, while she tried to hurt me and complained about how my cancer interfered with her social plans, making the contrast in character impossible to ignore. Grandpa slowly stood, leaning on his cane, walked over to Lena, and placed a hand on her shoulder, and for a brief second I thought he might soften, but instead he looked her straight in the eyes and said 6 words that ended everything. You should have been more kind. The words hit the room like an explosion, Lena's knees buckling as Ryan grabbed her before she fell, my mom rushing to her side while glaring at me with pure hatred, and my dad standing frozen as shock, rage and disbelief washed over his face. Grandpa returned to his chair looking every bit his age and dismissed them all, saying he wanted to speak with his grandson privately. They filed out slowly like mourners at a funeral, Lena needing support from both Ryan and my mom, my dad lingering at the door as if he might say something before leaving without a word, and even Marjorie stepping out after kissing my forehead to give us space. Alone with Grandpa Walter, the weight of everything finally settled on me and I told him this was too much and I never wanted any of it, but he gently interrupted and said he knew, reminding me I didn't ask for cancer, didn't ask to be mistreated and didn't ask him to disinherit anyone. But life hands us circumstances without permission and what matters is how we respond. I whispered that they were going to hate me forever, and he calmly said their anger was misplaced, that they made choices and now faced consequences, and blaming me was easier than owning their failures. He took my hand, his grip surprisingly strong, and told me he wouldn't live forever, that his health wasn't what it once was, and he needed to know that what he built would go to someone who would honor it, saying I was that person and always had been. I admitted quietly that I wasn't sure I was strong enough, and he answered simply that I'd survived cancer surgery, endured my sister trying to suffocate me, and still chose recovery over revenge, reminding me that strength isn't the absence of fear but moving forward anyway. We sat together in silence as sunlight poured through the tall windows and voices drifted in from outside, my family likely blaming me instead of themselves, and eventually he told me I didn't need to make any decisions now, that the inheritance wouldn't transfer until his death, which he planned to delay as long as possible, but he wanted me to know I had a future beyond cancer and rejection, that neither defined me, only my choices did. I stayed at the estate for hours after everyone left, Mrs. Caldwell bringing tea and cookies just like when I was a kid, Grandpa and I playing chess on the terrace, and for a little while I let myself pretend everything was normal, that my family hadn't fallen apart, that chemo and radiation weren't waiting for me, and that the future wasn't one big unknown. But real life doesn't stay quiet for long, and it came crashing back and fast. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from my parents and Lena, each one more vicious than the last, calling me ungrateful, manipulative, accusing me of being a snake who poisoned Grandpa Walter against them. Lena even sent a text saying I'd ruined her life and that she hoped my cancer would come back, And my dad left a voicemail telling me I was no longer his son, which was the moment I finally blocked every one of their numbers without hesitation. The weeks that followed were hard in ways that had nothing to do with medical charts or hospital rooms. Chemo was brutal, constant nausea, crushing exhaustion, losing my hair, and a bone-deep fatigue that made even standing up feel like climbing a mountain. But somehow the physical pain was easier to manage than the emotional wreckage left by my family blowing apart. Aunt Marjorie stepped in fully, taking time off work to stay with me through treatment, driving me to appointments, holding my hair back when I got sick, and sitting beside me during long nights when anxiety made sleep impossible. And in doing all that, she became the family I should have had all along. Grandpa Walter visited when his health allowed, bringing books and sharing stories about starting his business from nothing, talking openly about failures, bad deals, and moments when he almost quit but didn't, his stories teaching me resilience without ever sounding like lectures. Dear Harris stayed optimistic about my outlook, explaining that the surgery had done its job and the chemo was working, with scans showing no new tumor growth and cancer markers steadily dropping, and with continued treatment and monitoring, he believed I had an excellent shot at long-term survival. About 6 months after everything went down at the hospital, Lena's engagement collapsed, with Ryan apparently deciding he didn't want to marry into a family imploding at that scale, or maybe realizing who Lena really was after watching her behavior firsthand, and according to people we both knew, she blamed me for that too. My parents tried exactly once to reconcile, showing up unannounced at Marjorie's house with flowers and apologies that sounded practiced and hollow, claiming they'd overreacted and just wanted their family back, while carefully avoiding any real acknowledgement that they'd stood by while Lena tried to suffocate me. My mom sat carefully on Marjorie's couch and said they'd had time to think and that family mattered more than money, then suggested that if I talked to Grandpa and told him we'd all made up, maybe he'd reconsider the inheritance, and that was when I saw the truth clearly. They weren't there for me, they were there for his money, and I was the obstacle in their way. I told them to get out, quietly but firmly, and when my dad accused me of being difficult and said mature adults move on, I reminded him exactly what they'd done, how they'd watched me struggle to breathe, dismissed my cancer as drama, and chose Lena's party over my life, and now wanted forgiveness only because the money was gone. When my mom said they were my parents and I owed them respect, I told her I didn't owe them anything and that they'd lost that right when they failed me, and I made it clear they weren't welcome back. They left, and the only time I ever saw them again was through lawyers. In the 2 years between that family meeting and Grandpa Walter's death, something unexpected happened. I began to understand the weight of what he'd placed on me. He invited me to shadow him at work, teaching me commercial real estate from the inside, and every Thursday afternoon we met at his downtown office where he walked me through deals, explaining not just the numbers but the people behind them, what tenants needed, which partnerships would last, and how to spot economic shifts before everyone else noticed. He told me money was just numbers on paper and that what mattered was what those numbers stood for: jobs, growing businesses, strong communities, and that real estate wasn't about buildings, it was about lives. Those lessons ended up meaning more to me than the inheritance itself, because he wasn't just teaching me how to manage wealth, he was passing on the values behind how he built it: fairness, ethics, and genuine care for the people affected by every decision. I also learned he'd been quietly keeping track of my recovery, every chemo session, every clean scan, every small victory, with Mrs. Caldwell filling him in not out of obligation but out of care. And it showed me how deeply he actually loved me in a way my parents never had. The last conversation we had before he passed stayed with me as we sat in his study, the same room where everything changed years earlier, his body frail but his mind sharp, when he said he didn't regret changing his will and that people had told him family should forgive anything, but he didn't agree. But letting cruelty slide isn't love at all, it's just cowardice dressed up as keeping the peace, and Grandpa Walter believed that to his core. He passed away 2 years later, quietly in his sleep at 88, and his funeral drew a huge crowd of business partners, longtime employees, and friends who respected his honesty and sharp mind. My parents showed up too, sitting in the back looking small and bitter, while Lena didn't bother to attend at all. The will reading was mostly ceremonial since Grandpa had already made his intentions clear, but hearing it stated out loud still felt unreal, confirming that I, Mike Bennett, was now the sole owner of a commercial real estate empire worth tens of millions. My dad sat rigid and silent through the whole thing, my mom cried softly, and when it was over they left without saying a word to me. I was 30 years old, officially cancer-free according to my latest scans, and suddenly wealthier than I ever imagined, and the responsibility of it all felt crushing. Grandpa had built something extraordinary, and now it was on me to protect and grow it. A weight that kept me awake at night wondering if I was really up to the task. Marjorie helped ease that transition, introducing me to Grandpa's trusted advisors and walking me through the properties and investments. And that's when I truly saw who my grandfather had been beyond the boardroom. He'd quietly funded scholarships, supported local charities, and helped employees through hard times without publicity or tax write-offs, simply because he believed it was the right thing to do. I chose to carry that forward by expanding the scholarship program and creating a foundation in his name to support cancer research and patient assistance. Because if illness taught me anything, it was how deeply medical crises wreck people financially as well as emotionally. For years after Grandpa's death, a letter from Lena finally reached me, forwarded through multiple addresses, the envelope worn and tired, and inside was a short note in her familiar looping handwriting saying she was sorry for what she did in the hospital, admitting she'd been jealous, scared, and selfish, saying she didn't expect forgiveness and understood why, but that she thought about that day constantly and hated who she'd been, and hoped I was healthy and happy. I read it 3 times, looking for manipulation or excuses, but it felt sincere, so I filed it away in a drawer without replying or throwing it out, because some wounds fade while others just scar over and stay as reminders of painful lessons. My parents never contacted me again, and from what I heard through mutual acquaintances, they downsized after my dad retired shortly before Grandpa died, and once I took control of the company, I restructured leadership and brought in executives who shared Grandpa's values. My father's role had already been quietly phased out during Grandpa's final year, a deliberate decision he'd made himself, and over time my parents' finances and social standing eroded together, a slow slide into bitterness and obscurity. I didn't take pleasure in their downfall, but I couldn't deny there was a sense of balance to it, because they'd made choices and those choices had consequences, and the universe has a way of settling accounts without needing revenge. 5 years after my diagnosis, Dr. Harris officially declared me in remission, with no return of cancer and lung function nearly back to normal, and standing in the office that once belonged to my grandfather, looking out over the city skyline, I thought about the 6 words he'd said to Lena: "You should have been more kind." They weren't fancy or dramatic, but they carried an entire philosophy about how to live, how to treat people, and how to build something that lasts. Kindness isn't weakness, it's quiet strength that doesn't need applause or recognition and expects nothing back. And Grandpa understood that better than anyone. I'd paid dearly through betrayal and loss of family ties that should have been unbreakable. But I'd gained something priceless too, the knowledge that I could survive the worst, face death, and still choose compassion. Under my leadership, the business flourished in ways that would have made Grandpa proud. Hiring based on character as much as skill, prioritizing people over profit, and making decisions guided by a simple principle that had cost my family everything: be kind. Sometimes late at night I wondered what might have happened if Lena hadn't pulled that oxygen tube, if my parents had defended me instead of dismissing me, if they'd chosen differently in that hospital room, but those questions led nowhere. We can't rewrite the past, only move forward carrying our scars and the wisdom they bring. I moved on stronger, steadier, and committed to honoring the man who saw my worth when my own parents didn't. And in the end, those 6 words changed everything, not because they were clever, but because they were true. They all should have been more kind, and because they weren't, because they chose cruelty and convenience over compassion and family, they lost what mattered most. I didn't celebrate that or gloat because that would have made me no better than them. Instead, I lived well, built something meaningful, and chose kindness every day, not because it was easy, but because it was right, and that turned out to be the only inheritance worth passing on.